There was a time when you could step onto a station platform, walk right up to a locomotive, and maybe even ride in the cab. No tickets, no questions, just trust. If you love lost eras and hidden stories, subscribe now. In the 1960s and the 1970s, the Midwest rails were dense with variety. Private railroads still ran intercity passenger trains until Amtrak changed everything in 1971. Canada followed later in the mid-1970s. Today's locked gates and distant viewpoints make it almost impossible to imagine how open and alive train watching once was. What this world lost is not just access, it is a culture that vanished almost overnight. So how did normal become forbidden? And what really slipped away? In the years before Amtrak, the rail map of the Midwest and nearby Canada looked nothing like it does today. Dozens of private railroads, names like Chicago and Northwestern, Milwaukee Road, Burlington Northern, and Soo Line operated their own passenger and freight trains. Tracks crisscrossed the landscape, threading through small towns and big cities, sometimes only a few miles apart. In Illinois, Wisconsin, Minnesota, and Michigan, the density of routes meant that trains passed by almost constantly. Some lines ran as many as a dozen scheduled passenger trains a day, with countless freights in between. This was the backdrop for everyday life, a world where the railroad's presence was impossible to ignore. Everything changed on May 1st, 1971, when Amtrak took over nearly all intercity passenger service in the United States. The familiar names and colorful trains of private companies vanished almost overnight, replaced by a single national operator and a much smaller network. In Canada, a similar transition played out in the mid-1970s when VIA Rail absorbed passenger routes from Canadian National and Canadian Pacific, consolidating what had been a patchwork of services under one banner. Before these watershed moments, the sheer number of trains and companies created a kind of openness. Stations bustled with activity, and the boundaries between railroad, employee, and community felt porous. With so many lines to watch and so much variety in equipment, it was easy for anyone to be swept up in the constant motion of railroading. This abundance set the stage for a culture of access and trust that would soon become a relic of the past. A young railfan could walk up to a depot window, ask a question, and find themselves invited inside to watch the agent work. The boundaries between enthusiast and employee blurred in these moments. Conductors and engineers, often veterans with decades on the rails, shared stories and advice with anyone who showed genuine interest. It was not unusual for a teenager with a camera and a notebook to be offered a seat in a caboose or a quick look inside a locomotive cab, sometimes with a word of caution, but more often with a smile and a wave. Trust was the unspoken rule. Crews recognized familiar faces along the line and treated regulars like honorary members of the railroad family. Mentorship happened in small ways. A clerk explaining how to read a timetable. A brakeman showing a kid how to fill out a train order form. A dispatcher letting someone listen in on the radio chatter. Paperwork was passed around. Radios crackled with real voices, and the tools of the trade, lanterns, keys, rule books, were sometimes placed in careful, curious hands. These encounters did not require special permission or official programs. They were simply part of the everyday rhythm, built on mutual respect and a shared fascination with the railroad's inner workings. For many, these moments sparked a lifelong love of trains, and the memory of that open, welcoming world lingers even as the tracks themselves have grown quieter. Stacks of carbon copy forms covered the clerk's desk, each waiting for a signature or a stamp. Nothing moved on the railroad without paperwork, train orders, clearance cards, and telegraph messages, all filled out by hand. The rhythm of the day was set by the shuffle of pages and the scratch of pens. Agents and clerks relied on these forms to keep trains running and crews informed, passing them through the open window or sliding them across the counter to a waiting conductor. Each document carried authority, but also a sense of personal trust. Names written in ink, instructions spelled out in careful script, every page a small handshake between people who knew each other by sight. Radios were basic, boxy, and heavy, usually with a single push to talk button. They carried voices across the yard and into the cabs, but their range was limited and their signal never quite clear. A dispatcher's instructions might crackle through the static, yet most communication still depended on face-to-face exchanges or written notes. Timetables, printed on thick paper, were folded into shirt pockets or tucked inside lunch boxes, checked and rechecked as trains came and went. Lanterns hung from hooks, keys jingled on belts, and every tool showed the marks of daily use. For the people who worked here, these objects were more than equipment. They were the language of trust and cooperation, shaping every encounter at the station window or along the platform. In this analog world, the tools of the railroad were as familiar and personal as a handshake. Every train on the line moved only by explicit written authority. Dispatchers, working from crowded offices lined with train sheets and telegraph keys, dictated the rhythm of the railroad. Their orders, carefully handwritten on carbon copy forms, traveled by wire or telephone to station agents who copied each message onto thin slips called flimsies. Conductors and engineers collected these orders, sometimes by grabbing a hoop from a station platform at speed, always double-checking the details before proceeding. The employee timetable, thick with rules and printed schedules, lived in every crew member's pocket, setting the pecking order for which train had the right of way. Semaphore signals stood watch along the tracks, their arms raised or lowered by hand from small towers, each movement relayed by a person who knew every train and every face. In this world, safety and authority depended on human attention and judgment. Every mile was managed through a chain of trust, each link held together by paper, voice, and a steady hand. Bright colors flashed across the rails: orange and black Milwaukee Road boxcars, green and yellow diesels from Burlington Northern, and red and white Sioux Line hoppers. Each railroad had its own look, its own logo, and every car rolled by without a trace of graffiti. Locomotives came in every shape and size: RS-11s from Alco, EMDF units, GEU boats, and Fairbanks Morse baby trains. No two trains were ever quite the same. Names like Hiawatha and Peninsula 400 were painted in bold script, promising speed and comfort to anyone watching from the platform. The sound was just as unforgettable. Wheels hammered over jointed rail, each gap in the track sending up a sharp metallic click that built into a thunder you could feel in your chest. Horns echoed through small towns, and the ground seemed to shake as a fast freight stormed past. For a railfan, this was a moving gallery, sight, sound, and motion, all alive and impossible to ignore. By the end of the 1970s, the doors that had once stood open began to close. Railroads faced mounting pressure from insurance companies and federal regulators to keep non-employees out of yards and off equipment. Liability became the new watchword. Signs went up, fences appeared, and the quiet handshake between railfan and crew gave way to formal policies and warnings. The familiar sight of a caboose trailing every freight faded just as quickly. As the Federal Railroad Administration approved end-of-train devices and the Staggers Act loosened economic rules, railroads moved to eliminate cabooses altogether. By 1980, the orange and red shanties that had served as rolling offices and social hubs were vanishing from the rails, replaced by blinking boxes of electronics. For the railfan, this was more than a change in scenery. The easy access to yards, the chance at a friendly wave from a passing crew, even the possibility of a ride in the last car. All of it slipped away behind locked gates and new rules. The era of trust and open invitation was over, replaced by a climate of caution and distance. Today, access to railroads is governed by liability, not trust. As automation and security tighten, authentic connection becomes rare, and nostalgia grows stronger. What we lost wasn't just scenery, but a sense of belonging. The tracks remain, but the open invitation is gone. Share your memories below.